Well, hello again. This is In Conservation with, I'm really happy to say it's the fifth series. I mean, this was born during lockdown, and I can't believe that 140 people later, we're here tonight talking with author, writer Jennifer Ackerman about her book, her latest book, which is called What an Owl Knows, which I have read and I actually love it. It's been so interesting reading some of the stuff in that book. And I have a ton of questions for you, Jennifer, about owls. But before we go any further, I'd like to say, or ask you even, how are you and where are you?
Well, thank you so much, first of all, for having me on the program tonight, and to everybody for joining us. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm doing well. I'm in Charlottesville, Virginia. So it's mid-afternoon for me. No sign of owls yet. But yeah, so I'm delighted to be here.
I was telling Jennifer earlier that I first came across her about a year ago when I was in Canada. I was actually on an island, Peely Island, and one of the people with me, who's going to be a guest actually in a couple of weeks' time, Marilyn Simons. She's another writer. She was telling me about this lady called Jennifer. She's written an amazing, well, a couple of really great books. One of them's called Genius of Birds, which when I heard about, I thought, wow, that sounds like an interesting read. And then the next thing is, here you are with a new book. So let me ask you, I mean, obviously you've written a couple of books about birds. You must obviously be interested in birds or not.
Yeah, it's actually my third book about birds. I read The Genius of Birds in 2016, The Bird Way in 2020, and now What an Owl Knows, which was just published in June. And so, I've been a bird watcher, bird lover since I was a kid. And my dad would take me bird watching when I was 7 or 8 years old. And we would go down on the C&O Canal in Washington, D.C., along the Potomac River. We get up before dawn and go out and bird watch. And it was the beginning of a lifelong love affair. And it was also a great way to spend time with my dad. I was one of five girls. So if you wanted time with my dad, he was a great bird watcher. And so it was the way to get a little bit of time with him. And it really did instill in me just such a passion for birds that's really endured. My first book was a book about the natural life of the mid-Atlantic coast, very heavy on birds. Originally published as Notes from the Shore in 1995, and then republished a couple of years ago as Birds by the Shore. So technically, this is really my fourth book about birds.
Well, great. I mean, as I said to you guys, you need to check out her previous books. Genius of Birds is the one that I really want to read. But anyway, we're talking about what an owl knows. And of course, owls are such incredible creatures. They are birds that every person interested in natural history really want to kind of see in real life. Many of us have had some sort of contact with them. And I'm hearing noises going off as I'm talking. So people are contacting me about owls. It's just amazing. And I've been a birder, all my life. And I was telling Jennifer well, actually yesterday, that I'm owls are one of the things that you kind of just unconsciously tuned into. And I remember being in bed one night and hearing middle of the night, 3 a.m, quick, just one quick. And I knew immediately it was a tawny owl. I kind of sprang out of bed thinking, tawny owl, you know. um, but it's interesting because I remember also being lucky enough to be in Australia. I was in the Northern Territories, and we were staying in a natural park, a national park called Kakadu, which is kind of well known in that area of the world. And every night I was hearing like dogs barking, and I was saying, think to myself, why are there loads of dogs barking? And I remember speaking to my guide one morning and saying, is there a bunch of feral dogs around? I'm thinking I want to go for a stroll outside in the dark, but I'm worried because I might get mauled by a pack of dogs. And he said, there's no dogs here. They're barking owls. And there were owls, and it was incredible. We actually found one and saw it singing or calling during the course of the night. have you had a fascination with owls that stems back a long way? How did you come to write this book?
Yes, actually, many, many years ago, when my children were little, we put up an owl box on the big old maple tree behind my kitchen window, and we got lucky. An eastern screech owl roosted in that box, and it was right at eye level looking out the kitchen window, and it wasn't but maybe, it was a very short distance, and it would sit with its little round head in that hole all day long, and then it would vanish at night. And in the morning, sometimes we would all gather around the kitchen table for breakfast. My girls were maybe 7 and 9 years old, and there were often the remnants of this owl's meal. I mean, one time there was the wing of a blue jay just hanging out from the hole. One time there was a whole mourning dove, and we watched while this dead bird hanging out of the box sort of twitched, and then was yanked into the hole by the owl. And I was just amazed at its hunting skills. I mean, this is a small owl able to take a mourning dove and a blue jay. And also, I never saw it come and go. It was so stealthy, and so it was really the beginning of a kind of fascination with owls. And everywhere I've gone, like you, I've just been, really drawn to these animals. And I was in the Pilliga Forest in Australia. I had the same experience you did. I was with a wildlife sound recording specialist, and we were wandering around the woods at night, and there was this barking, I mean, really in the middle of nowhere. And I said to him, who has got their dogs out here? And he said, that's no dog. That's a barking owl. So it's an amazing creature. And so, I've now been all over the world looking at owls, and they're just so diverse and so interesting, diverse in their size and appearance, and also their lifestyle, their way of living. So it's been quite a journey, and really, really a fascinating one for me.
I know you got a few images to show us, but I just wanted to ask you firstly, do you remember your first ever owl encounter, and what species was it?
Oh gosh, it was a great horned owl, and it was at a friend's farm, and it was roosting in a tree, actually above their chicken coop. So I think he was getting some good feeding there. And I think what struck me was just first of all, the size of this bird. It's a huge owl, and also it's quiet. I mean, it was just, if it hadn't been pointed out to me, I would never have known it was there. Even if it flew, their flight is so quiet. So it was, yeah, it was just left a really big impact on me.
And what was the last owl you saw?
Oh, the last owl I saw was, let's see, wait a minute. Oh, I think it was a spectacled owl in a parking lot in Cali, Colombia.
Oh, really?
Yes. Also total surprise. And I was led there by some people at the Cali Bird Fair. But one of the staff members had discovered that there was a spectacled owl roosting in a tree just above the parking lot behind her apartment, and that was fantastic for me because I'd never seen one before.
Well, I'm not either, actually, but that's
Yeah.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, well, do you think you could show us some images just to remind us in case we didn't know what an owl looked like?
Sure, absolutely.
Whilst you're setting that up, just to let you know, guys watching now, but if you could put yourself on gallery view, then you won't see it that well. Put it on the Zoom setting on speaker view. And also, if you just joined us, if you can think of something really interesting that an owl thinks, slip it in the direct messages to me. And at the end of this session, we will pick a winner, and you can win a copy of the book.
So I just wanted to share with you a few owl images. So one of the delights of this book was that I got permission from the publisher to actually include photographs. And so there are 75 photographs of owls, 50 in black and white and 25 in color. And I really found some terrific images, I think. This is a long-eared owl in Serbia. And one of the ways that I got to know David was by reaching out to him to ask him about his experience with long-eared owls in Kikinda in Serbia. And so that was, he shared with me some really amazing stories. And that was a wonderful part of that that section of the book, which is about the various ways that owls weather the winter, how some of them roost and some of them actually migrate. Here we have spectacled owls. This picture was taken by a friend of mine, Pete Myers, who has spent a fair amount of time in Latin America and caught this really spectacular view of spectacled owls. Burrowing owls, which I spent time in Brazil with David Johnson, who's with the Global Owl Project. He has a big scale project really for all over the northern and southern hemisphere, looking at burrowing owls. And we were in Brazil doing a study of some owls in a fairly urban area in Maringá, Brazil. I just think they're quite comical and delightful owls. This is a crested owl, just a beautiful bird. And of course, a great gray owl. And in the book, I talk a great deal about the kind of, I think, what I would describe as the extraordinary sensory superpowers of owls. And of course, the great gray has that amazing facial disc that helps it zero in on the sounds, the very subtle sounds of mice and voles deep beneath the snow. This is a barred owl. I'm gonna try to play the sound for you, but let me know if it comes through. Got it. Okay, yeah, that's a really common. The barred owl is everywhere in the States. It used to be just an eastern bird, but it's really spread quite a bit. It's ranged to the west, all the way to the West Coast, where it's actually causing some problems for the spotted owl populations on the West Coast. But one of the things that I learned about in the book was the variety of vocalizations of these birds, and what scientists have learned lately about the individual identities that are conveyed through their vocalizations, and also just the particular vocalizations they use in very different contexts for specific purposes. So they don't just hoot, they also chitter and squawk and squeal. All of these different vocalizations, as I said, used in very specific contexts. There's a great horned owl, and I think I got two vocalizations here, so you can hear the difference, but individual differences in the voices. Can you hear that? Okay. And this is a greater city owl, and I'm going to play its call, which I think is just so eerie and marvelous. Bit of a scream there. So those are just some teasers of some of the images in the book, and yeah, and so now I look forward to talking to some more about owls. Yeah,
Absolutely. Well, we are going to be talking about owls without any doubt tonight. Actually, it's interesting you talk about the calls, because I remember being on the Azores, which are kind of halfway between I guess Portugal, Africa, and the US. And at this time of year, people are rushing over there because they want to try and see as many vagrants as possible. For me, I'd rather spend the extra £200 and go to America. But anyway, and they are walking around and they're playing the calls of an eastern screech owl. And when I first heard this call, I was thinking, is this for real? Listen to this call. Can you hear it?
I can't hear it.
Okay. If you can't hear it, unfortunately, I'm sorry you can't hear it, because it sounds like a little whinnying pony, like My Little Pony. And I'm thinking, because I didn't know what it was at first, I was thinking it was someone just making some kind of silly recording. But actually, it works in terms of bringing out small passerines. And I guess the American or North American passerines are very familiar with that call, and obviously that's why they jump out of the bushes as soon as they hear that. Which I think
Right.
is cheating a little bit, but you know. And
Yeah,
go back. Sorry, I'll just
I was
say
just gonna
after you.
the screech owls. I was just going to say they have such a variety of calls. There's a screech owl that's a captive bird at one of the at the International Owl Center in Minnesota, and it has a call like the ring of a telephone. And it sounds just like a ringing telephone. And so that when the staff is, and it will answer to when an actual phone rings, it will respond with its own ring. So when the staff gets a phone call, they can, it's hard for them to keep a straight face because this bird is in their background. They're just kind of ringing away. So great variety of calls. Yeah.
Yeah, there is, but it's also interesting that within that variety, there seems to be common sounds. I mean, for example, your barred owl, just about to say barred warbler, your barred owl, it sounds a bit like our tawny owl in Europe, and it's the same genus, Strix.
Yes.
And similarly with the great horned owl, it doesn't sound that dissimilar to the Eurasian eagle owl, and both of them are buboes. So it's interesting that some of these birds, and also the masked owl, which you played a call of, again, sounds very much like a barn owl, and I guess they're the same genus as well, isn't it?
Right. Right. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think there are similar elements, and the differences, within an individual species are very subtle. So, one of the portraits that I describe in the book is a woman was trained as a musician, but she has now turned her attention to the vocalizations of Eurasian eagle owls, and she's very, very good at distinguishing between the individual voices of these different birds. And it's a great once you can distinguish between individuals, it gives you two capabilities. Really, it's easier to monitor a population because you can actually keep track of individuals more accurately. And also it gives you a window into their social lives. You can sort of keep track of who's mating with whom and whether pairs are actually staying together. So it's become quite a useful tool to be able to do this.
Absolutely. Now, in the book, obviously you talk about where owls come from. And I was surprised to read, because I always thought that owls were related to nightjars because they look like nightjars.
Yeah.
Apparently not.
No, we used to think owls were, first of all, we thought they were most closely related to falcons and hawks because of their hunting style. And then, yes, we lumped them in with nightjars and other nocturnal birds. But the new DNA research shows that the closest relatives to owls aren't hawks or nightjars, but they're actually day active birds like speckled mouse birds, rhinoceros hornbills, kingfishers, woodpeckers. You wouldn't think it, but that's what the DNA shows.
It's just fascinating, and I find it hard sometimes to swallow that, because as a birder, for example, you have Jaegers, we call them skewers.
Mhm.
And for years, for generations, since I was born, since the moment I looked at a book and can understand it, a bird book that is, I thought that skewers, Jaegers, were related to gulls, in turn related to terns, who then were related eventually to pigeons, what have you, and before the skuas and jaegers was the Yorks. But again, you read the latest sort of research, and it tells you that they are much more closely related to auks than they are to gulls, even though they look like gulls. And that
Right.
kind of messes with my mind a little bit. I find it difficult sometimes. And to tell me that an owl is more closely related to a woodpecker than it is to a nightjar, I find that a
Right.
bit difficult.
Yeah, it's very strange. And in some cases, these very um distantly related birds have converged on very similar habits and lifestyles, but and that, that is definitely confusing for the the average birder.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, for someone who's just knows about owls, I mean, I can't think of anyone on this planet that hasn't heard of an owl under whatever guise in terms of name.
Mhm.
Is it always in terms of folklore and how people who aren't sort of educated in that respect, is it always a thing that they think of owls as birds of doom, as bad birds, as dangerous to people birds, you know?
Yeah, yeah, no, first of all, owls really are ubiquitous in the symbolism of cultures around the world. The ethno-ornithologists have actually surveyed people in different cultures, hundreds of different cultures around the world, and owls really pop to the top as a group of birds that seem to predominate in the symbolism and stories of so many different cultures. Um, but the attitudes vary tremendously from culture to culture. So some cultures, like the Ainu people of northern Japan, they really revere owls. They consider them protectors of their villages. This is true too of the Yagan of Tierra del Fuego. They consider the barn owl as kind of this wise grandmother who generates lots of life-giving aspects of their lives. But as you say, there are also cultures that view owls as emblems of evil. They're bad omens that are linked with death. I think in particular of a country like Belize, where owls are just viewed as bearers of bad luck. So if an owl comes to your house and calls, it the belief is that it means somebody inside the house will get sick or die. And that view of owls, or some kind of slight variations of it, is actually a very prevalent perspective in many countries, Zambia, Kenya, Nepal.
Yeah. You also talk about the owl itself, because we mentioned the physiological sides of the owl, and that fascinates me too. I mean, one thing I read in your book, which I never knew, I thought that all owls were silent when they flew, but in actual fact, they're not.
No, that's right. There are exceptions to the quiet flight rule in owls, and one of them are the fish owls. They don't depend on hearing so much for their hunting of fish, and so their flight is not as quiet as, say, a great gray or a barn owl that absolutely depends on hearing for its hunting. I think that the quiet flight of most species of owls is just one of the wonders of the animal world. I think it's just remarkable, because you think about how most owls have more feathers than other birds of prey. They have a lot of feathers. Feathers generally make noise. They rasp together, they rustle. Birds make a lot of noise in flight generally, but with owls, they have their wings, feathers are coated with these plush fibers. It's almost like velvet, and it reduces the sound of that rasping. And then they also have really marvelous feature, the comb which is a row of kind of fine hair-like bristles that runs along the leading edge of their wing. And that meets the oncoming air. And when the airflow hits that comb, the little serrations, the bristles, they kind of break up the turbulence, and they quiet that swoosh sound that most birds make in flight.
You do mention in the book the conundrum, the question: is the silent flight in order for them to hear and not to be heard? Which is it?
Yes, so I think the consensus is that it's both. If they need to hear very faint sounds, they need to quiet themselves as much as possible. And they also don't want to alert their prey. So I think it's a combination of things, that those two factors that really have led to the evolution of this quiet flight.
And just how good? I mean, these questions that I'm sure a lot of people have been wanting to ask anyway. How good is an owl's hearing?
Oh my gosh, it's really phenomenal. So, I think it was in the 1960s that the famous biologist Roger Payne was really the first to show that an owl can actually catch a rodent, a mouse, in the pitch black, relying only on sound. And so, owls that hunt by ear, like great gray owls, barn owls, their whole head is designed for listening, like that uh, great gray owl photo I showed. That facial disc is just like a kind of feathered satellite, and it collects sound, channels it toward the ears and the side of the head. And those little holes that are the owl's ears, it's what's inside there that is just so astounding. The inner ear of an owl has been called the race car, the Ferrari of sound sensitivity. It's so extraordinary that, and it's because they have these really big cochlea, the hearing organs of the brain. For instance, in a barn owl, it's just super long. It's like 3 or 4 times the length of the cochlea in other birds. And that gives barn owls a sense of hearing that's almost unequaled in the animal world. It's really quite extraordinary.
And sight. I mean, I've read somewhere that the owl's sight isn't that much more than ours in terms of its keenness. Um, is that right?
Well, they don't have the kind of acuity that, say, a hawk would, but they have very large eyes for their body size. And I actually like to say to people, if my eyes were in similar proportion to my body as an owl's eyes are to its body, they'd be about the size of an orange and they'd weigh 4 pounds. So these are very big eyes. And they're forward facing, so they have binocular vision. That's a huge advantage when you're trying to zero in on moving prey. And also, what's extraordinary about their vision is really it's their capacity in dim light. So they have their pupils can swell to almost the whole size of the eye, and that they can and they're also their retinas have many rods, those light sensitive cells. So their sensitivity to light is about 100 times that of a pigeon. So they really do have quite extraordinary vision in dim light.
It's fascinating how they operate in terms of, because I remember reading in your book about the fact they can open their pupils up so big. It's just incredible to think that. You also said that there's roughly 260 different species of owl in the world.
Yes.
And you're talking about sort of hotspots in terms of diversity. Can you explain about that? Because it seems like everywhere has an owl somewhere, even if it's not necessarily next to your house.
This is true. And they have adapted to just every kind of niche, all grasslands, mountainous regions, boreal forest, rainforest. They really occupy just about every region, and every kind of habitat except, in Antarctica. So they really are, there's tremendous diversity. There's greater diversity in some parts of the globe, southeastern Brazil, southwestern US and parts of Mexico. There are parts of Southeast Asia that have great diversity. And those are areas that have never experienced glaciation, for one thing, and so they have a lot of diversity of habitat. And owls they're at the top of the food chain. So the diversification really is about niches, and because they really they require a kind of domination of a habitat. So an extraordinary thing, I think, that they have diversified to occupy so many different kinds of niches.
But they're so bloody hard to find. I've spent there's in Europe we have the Eurasian scops owl, which is a very rare visitor to Britain, but it's found in Mediterranean areas. And in Spain, where I'm based, I can go to somewhere like Pamplona in northern Spain. I could be walking down the middle of the city and I hear it calling. And in Extremadura in southwest Spain, where you'd expect there'd be more because there's less urbanization there.
Yeah,
it's like murder to find one. And there's one that lives in a tiny park. Literally, you can walk from one end of the park from one end to the other in maybe 30 seconds. It's tiny. It's basically a little island surrounded by roads and housing. But there's been one there for 5 or 6 years, or a pair there. And 5 or 6 years I've spent standing under the tree that people tell me it's in, which is a very small horse chestnut tree, and I'm looking and I can't see a thing. And then I come back with heat sensitive cameras. I'm looking and I can't see a thing. It took me 4 years. And eventually this year I managed to see it. And it was out. It just looked like it was obvious. I thought, how the hell did I miss that? They're so difficult to see, and their camouflage must rank up there as the best in the world when it comes to to birds or any other animal for that matter. But it's interesting because owls really rely on their camouflage. I mean, other birds who probably spent eons developing their plumage, like snipe, for instance,
yeah.
to merge with the background, but they don't trust their camouflage. You can walk into a bit of grass there and suddenly a snipe jumps up. You're thinking, you're an idiot. Just stay where you were. I'll never have seen you. Do what the owls do.
That's it. The stillness is so much a part of their camouflage. And I mean, the camouflage is absolutely incredible. I was out in Montana, and we were trying to capture these long-eared owls in the mist nets, and it was my job to keep my eye on this particular owl so that they were setting up the mist net. And I every time I just glanced away for a second, I couldn't find this owl again. It looked just like a tree branch. It was extended all vertically, and its plumage was just perfect tree bark plumage. And this is true for like great gray owls against a larch tree. They just completely vanish. And then they have really perfected the art of stillness. And little owls, the little owls that are sometimes yes, right. Right. The prey of bigger owls, they have really learned how, they have evolved ways of being absolutely invisible. And I think about like the northern saw-whet owl, and in the northern hemisphere in North America, was considered just a very, very rare bird. And it turned out it was just rarely seen. It's one of the most common raptors in North America. People just don't see this little bird. So they assumed that it was very rare. But once they started to catch them in mist nets to study them, turned out that the populations were healthy and thriving.
Yeah, I saw one during the biggest week this year in Ohio. I was walking on the boardwalk, and luckily someone said there's an owl up there, and I looked, and I saw it because someone told me. I would have walked straight past it. And even, you've mentioned this in your book. You talked about the phenomenal gatherings of long-eared owls in Serbia, northern Serbia. We've actually had Milan Risic, who is the president of the Serbia BirdLife, and my Serbian brother, the man that introduced me to those owls 15 years ago. And even though there's like maybe 20 or 30 in a tree, when you first arrive in Serbia and you think, right, I'm going to see a load of owls, you really have to get your eye in first. Even though there's a ton of them in a tree, you have to really get your eye in. And suddenly when you see one, you see two, you see three, and then whatever number you've seen, you got to multiply at least twice, because you know there's going to be birds that you haven't noticed at all.
Absolutely. And I remember Milan saying that there are still people in the villages there who have never seen an owl, even though they're everywhere above their heads in these villages. You know, people don't necessarily look up, but they're again so well camouflaged. So just, yeah, very hard to pick them out.
Yeah, and talking about being in Serbia, it's interesting because the owl capital of the world is a small town called Kikinda on the Hungarian border in northern Serbia. But in some of the villages nearby, you know, I remember I was with Milan actually this January, and we were walking through a village, and he found a couple of owls in a small garden, and he said to me, because I was looking at the owl, and someone came up to me and sort of said, "What are you looking at?" And before I can answer it, even though that person wouldn't understand because I'm speaking in English, he basically told me afterwards that he didn't want to necessarily tell people that they had owls in their gardens, because some of the people still have this sort of thought that they're birds of evil and let's cut the tree down or shoot the bird to get rid of it. It's
Mhm.
just it's just incredible. These perceptions still exist to this day.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, there are incredible efforts going on to educate people, and Milan has certainly been leading the charge in Serbia, but all over the world there are now real efforts to try to educate people about, especially children, about the natural history of these birds, and to try to counter some of those superstitions and misperceptions about these birds. And they're, you know, they're making some headway. You know, they're in Nepal. They have they're having some festivals, owl festivals, and you know, trying to draw people in and introduce them to the birds so that they see that they're birds, and you know, not emblems of evil in any way.
If there's any children watching this, how would you explain that age-old question? How does an owl turn its head? And can it turn its head all the way around?
Yeah. Well, you know, it is a myth that they can turn their head all the way around. They can't, but some species can turn their heads three-quarters of the way around, 270 degrees, and that's mighty impressive. That's like 3 times the twisting flexibility that we humans possess.
Well, that's a nice, easy way of explaining it, because I find it very difficult to tell a young kid how an owl turns its head. Um, but questions that kids often ask is, because I'm a kid myself, what's the biggest owl?
Oh, biggest owl is the Blakiston's fish owl. It's the size of a fire hydrant. It's way big, and it's kind of wacky looking. It has these tousled ear tufts, and a very, very strange looking bird, and eats fish. I mean, that's its diet. So it doesn't have the kind of flat facial disc that you see in a lot of birds, owls that hunt by ear, but it's and it lives in Japan and in parts of Russia. I got to see Blakiston's fish owls when I was in Hokkaido many years ago, and uh, they are really magnificent birds. They're just enormous and very imposing.
And the opposite end of the scale, what's the
Yeah,
smallest?
the little tiny elf owls, which are, you know, little nuggets of a bird, you know, about the size of a small pine cone. But you know, they are also really fierce hunters. So, you know, you look at these little birds and you think, oh, you know, they can't do any damage or anything. They're very fierce hunters. So elf owls, flammulated owls, all those little forest owls are impressive predators.
So talking about fearsomeness, it's interesting because owls. Up until today, I thought all owls were quiet, but obviously not. But owls can sort of sneak up on you when you're not looking, much to your detriment. For example, Eric Hoskin, the famous British photographer way back, I think in the 40s and 50s, maybe even the 60s as well. He lost his eye to a tawny owl whilst he was trying to photograph one near its nest. And I've been with people in Serbia who've been trying to monitor Ural owls, and they scare the living daylights out of me, that species, because they seem to be bloody vicious. In fact, there's a story that one of the guys told me in which he was climbing up a ladder to check a Ural owl's nest in a hole in the tree, and he thought the female had flown off. That's why he did it. He just made his break and jumped up there to see if he can. Next thing, the Ural owl returned and sunk her claws into his shoulder. But this guy, I mean, he's my hero, because he said he simply pulled out the talons out of his shoulder, his bleeding shoulder, and he put a ring on the leg of the owl, which I thought, what a man. But in your view, what's the most vicious owl that you could come across?
Well, the Ural owls have a reputation for sure. They're just fierce nest defenders, and I know that in some places in Finland and elsewhere, people wear helmets to protect themselves while they're doing banding and that sort of thing. But they have to wear a soft helmet because these birds, these Ural owls, will slam into a hard helmet so hard that they'll knock themselves out. So the researchers wear soft helmets that won't damage the owls. They also don't protect the humans as well as they might. But yeah, Ural owls have a fierce reputation. So do snowy owls. Denver Holt has told me he's been hit a number of times by snowy owls, both males and females. And he tells a story once of bending over a nest to remove the chicks for a study, and a snowy owl came in from behind and just nailed him in the rear, and poked through all the these tough canvas pants on and everything, really hurt him. So yeah, snowy owls and Ural owls, I think, are the ones that can cause the most damage when you're up close like that.
Is there a hierarchy in the woodlands? Because in Europe, in the temperate woodlands in Europe, you think, when you look at owls and you don't know much about them, you think, oh, all owls are sort of fearsome creatures. But then you soon realize that there's a hierarchy. So, for example, I've been told that long-eared owls won't nest anywhere near tawny owls because tawny owls will eat them for dinner. So tawny owls are dominant over the long-eared owls. Is there a similar situation with species in North America?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I mentioned all those little forest owls. They are prey for, great horned, barred, all the bigger owls. So there's definitely a hierarchy. And, my impression is that in Europe, the Eurasian eagle owl, I mean, that bird can take a small deer. It's such such an amazing predator, and it can certainly take smaller owls. So yeah, there's certainly a pecking order, as so to speak, in our forests too. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, because I was in Germany a couple of years ago, or maybe actually before lockdown. It's funny how the pandemic, those years just disappeared,
Oh, yeah.
though they were a major part of our lives.
Yeah.
To the pandemic, I was in Germany. I was doing a tour, research tour, because I was writing a book about urban birding in cities in Germany and Austria and Switzerland. And I was in this city called Wuppertal, which I'd never heard of, but Wuppertal, I think, has the only or the first ever floating railway system. So they were like, that's their claim to fame. And also it's apparently the most forested, or maybe the wettest, certainly, city in Germany. But it also has the biggest population of eagle owls in Germany, apparently. And I remember standing by a kind of a man-made cliff, a bit of an excavation, I suppose. And there was a petrol station. So I was basically in the petrol station looking at this cliff, and apparently there was a pair nesting, but I couldn't see them. But they were chief predators of rats. They just ate rats the whole time. And in the UK, there's a lot of argument because people are saying, well, eagle owls used to occur here. Other people say they never did because occasionally pairs are found.
Mm.
There was one maybe 10, 15 years ago, a pair in Yorkshire, and people were worried that they would be hunting birds like hen harriers, which are in England very, very rare. So they basically were specialists in that field. And it's really interesting when you think that such a apex predator can exist in an urban area. Have you seen in your research, have you seen much evidence of owl species actually living in urban areas?
Oh, sure. I mean, the first powerful owl I ever saw was in the center of Sydney, Australia, and in the Botanic Garden there. It was just, it was, again, if I would never have seen it if the park warden hadn't pointed it out to me. But that bird was thriving in a very urban environment. And actually the Eurasian eagle owl that escaped the Central Park Zoo, Flaco, is still, you know, making his way in Central Park and doing quite well. He's feeding himself very adequately. I mean, there are, when I was in South America, the burrowing owl is, you know, making its home in urban areas because it's agriculture is really pushing it out of some of the surrounding grasslands where it prefers to nest. And so it's nesting in cities now and in suburban areas, and doing quite well. There are obviously, you know, threats. One of the chief among them is rodenticides, I think. You know, people, if they're using rat poisons, though, and the owls take those rats, the poison really does a number on their own bodies. So, and there's also, you know, traffic and other kinds of threats. But there was a fascinating study about the burrowing owl and the ways that it's adapting to the city environment. And the studies show that they've actually, some changes in their brain genes have happened only over the course of a few decades. And these are genes that are involved in attention, for instance, so that allowing the owls possibly to tune out the ambient noise of a city so that they could hear their prey, this more subtle noises of their prey. So some of these birds are really, I think, very adaptable and are finding their way in quite dense urban environments.
Yeah, I mean, there's been, you know, you've seen, I'm sure you've seen the reports of snowy owls in places like Detroit
Mm-hmm.
and other such species. I mean, I've even seen burrowing owl in Sao Paulo as well.
Yes.
So you know, it's interesting that they get there. Going back to Flaco, the escaped Eurasian eagle owl hanging out in Central Park, is there a worry that this bird might try and breed with a great horned owl?
Yeah, I think there's some concern about that. There's also the concern about, you know, a non-native apex predator and, you know, introduced to an environment like that. And I think those are legitimate worries. I don't know about the interbreeding with the great horned owl. It's possible, I suppose. Um, but Flaco doesn't seem to have been seen with any of the local, you know, resident owls. So he's pretty much a loner at this point.
That's funny. Excuse me. Now, I guess there's a sort of a serious part. I mean, it's all serious, but there's a part of this conversation which we need to kind of address, and that is the threats that owls face in common with practically every bird on the planet
Yeah.
suffering from habitat loss. Obviously, in their sort of hotspots, especially forest, deforestation is a major thing. What are the real threats? I mean, is it mostly deforestation? What else is threatening these birds?
Yeah, I mean, it's habitat loss generally. It's the loss of old growth forests. A lot of owls depend on hollows for their nests in old growth trees, and they have to be of a certain size. Also, the loss of grasslands, where a lot of owl species do their hunting. So the loss of meadows, grasslands, old growth forests, I think those are the big threats to owls. But again, there are others like rodenticides and some also some of the climate change issues that are happening that of areas warming and ranges shifting, and including mountain of zone, if an owl lives at a particular zone on a mountain and that shifts upward. So there are lots of threats, and I will say that one of the real areas of mystery still is that we don't really have our arms around the numbers of owls in the populations in various species. They are so difficult to monitor and survey, and we've really gotten it very wrong in the past. I think of the snowy owl population, and not too long ago we thought we had maybe 200,000 snowy owls, but it turns out that we were counting the same owls twice, sometimes three times, because they were nesting in different areas around the Arctic regions. And so now the population is maybe, we think, closer to 30,000. That's a huge difference. And so, just the question of getting the numbers, I think that's a huge challenge in conservation right now, to identify which species are actually under threat.
Yeah, because in London, for example, there's been surveys to count tawny owls, for example, and they found that there's actually far more tawny owls around than people expected.
Mhm.
Little owls, and my friend, a little owl here, initially they thought there were maybe 5 or 6 pairs in London, but it now turns out there's maybe more than 60 pairs because,
Wow.
as you say, it's very difficult to actually locate them, and people are going to the same spots to see birds that are showing well, when in
Mhm.
reality, you can go to an area which has good habitat, and you may even be lucky to find one. I remember finding or hearing one on my local patch in the middle of West London. And I know there's someone in the audience tonight who may talk during the Q&A about his experiences with long-eared owls, because he's often sending me stuff on WhatsApp about his long-eared owls that he discovered. So, sorry, not long-eared owls, little owls. So, there are some, as you say, difficulties. I mean, there's species that have come from nowhere, isn't there, that have been kind of discovered or potentially discovered and found to be actually a bit more common than people thought. And there's cryptic species as well, isn't there?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And so we don't even know the number of species yet. They're still turning up, in places like off the coast of West Africa, the island of Principe. There was a new species of Scops owl that turned up there just last year. So we have still a lot of a lot of work to do to get our arms around the numbers of species and the populations of each.
Yeah, and I remember reading or seeing pictures from Southeast Asia, because I guess not necessarily due to the Harry Potter effect, but certainly people were wanting owls as pets, and in the illegal markets, researchers found species that hadn't been seen for years, in these markets. So it's just, as you say, we have a lot to learn, and I just hope that we keep the forests and woods long enough so we can actually understand what's in them. Oh, that's a big, big subject we can discuss all night, all
Mm.
day. But I have a couple of questions for you. And one question is, Jennifer,
Yes.
if you could be anywhere on this planet right now, where would you be?
That's a really hard one. You know, I think I would love to see Papua New Guinea. I'd love to see the bowerbirds there, the birds of paradise. But there are other places too, like the Atlantic rainforest, which I've been to, but I haven't explored in any detail. And it's just such a rich natural area. There's so many places, very hard for me to pick just one.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, maybe you can pick just one of the next question. What would be your favorite owl?
Okay. Yeah. Again, we talked about it is like picking a favorite child, but I do love burrowing owls. I have to say they're just so so comical, and they have these big heads on these long stilt-like legs, and they kind of this habit of kind of cocking their head that looks like almost in curiosity. And the fact that they nest underground in burrows. Also, I learned while researching the book that they actually decorate their burrows, which I thought was quite extraordinary. They bring all kinds of treasures to the mouth of the burrow. They bring, corn stalks and corn cobs and bits of wood and bone and moss and cloth, all these things, to decorate their nests. So I think I would have to say they're probably my favorite, but I do love them all.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. I'm sure you do. Well, I think we've actually come to a close on our conversation about what an owl knows. And Jennifer, you must show us a copy
Oh,
of
yes.
the book and speak while you're doing it.
Okay, this is the UK edition, and it has, as I said, all those lovely photographs and throughout the text, and also a color well in the middle. So some great pictures, but yeah, lots of new information in the book, and some portraits of the people who are studying owls, and what an extraordinary group of human beings these people are. I mean, talk about dedication. Owls are not easy to study, and these people have been at it for decades, and the things that they've learned are just quite astounding.
Well, I must echo that and also say that it's an astounding book by yourself, Jennifer Ackerman. What a great book. What an owl knows. You should get yourself a copy because it's absolutely fabulous. Just to let you know, we've got a couple more interviews this week, actually. On Wednesday, the 4th of October, we've got Richard Gregory from the RSPB, the Royal Society for Protection of Birds, and he's discussing the State of Nature Report 2023, which unfortunately doesn't make great reading. And on Thursday, another fellow American, Heather Wolf, who actually works with the Cornell Laboratory for Ornithology, and she has a new book out called How to Find More Birds. So we'll be talking to her about how to find more birds. And I'd like to thank everyone for watching this In Conservation With episode. If you're watching this online on YouTube, please like and subscribe and tell your friends about it, because there's so much information. This particular one has been amazing. Jennifer, thank you so much for sparing your afternoon to talk to us about what owls know.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you, David.
Thank you. And don't forget, by the way, oh, I nearly forgot, keep looking up.
Yes.